Alright, welcome to Unit 10, Lecture 2. I want to start with looking at your outline for the week this week. You have a short week this week. You only have 4 days in school, but as requested, we are going to keep our due date as Friday at 11:59. This week you have 3 assignments that are going to be due by Friday. First, you have your journal as always. With your journal, you are going to reflect on the lecture and you are going to reflect on the 6 readings that you have for this week, 3 on the online site and 3 that are posted as PDFs in your teams. Then you have 2 additional assignments. One is your Unit 10 document set 2, and the second is the U.S. on the home front document analysis. Make sure that you follow directions on both of those. All of your assignments, like I said, are due on Friday. You don't have in-person school on Friday. You don't have online school on Friday, but make sure you get your assignments turned in by then. So, what are we doing this week? We have 2 sections to cover. First, we are going to cover the U.S. fighting in World War I, and then we are going to cover the next section on what a post-war United States looks like. Where do we go after this war? We're going to start with the U.S. fighting in World War I because as we left off last week, the United States has now moved completely away from neutrality and is now involved in the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States is going to have a presence in 2 theaters in World War II. The first that we are going to go over is the European theater. When we look at the European theater, we have to go back just a little bit and talk about the actions of Germany. So when we look at what Germany was doing, shortly after World War II begins, Germany is going to invade and occupy northwest France and this is going to be beginning in May of 1940. Now, the United States doesn't enter until December of 1941, and then within a year, in 1942, the United States and the British are going to consider the possibility of a major Allied invasion across the English Channel. The Allied plans are going to begin to ramp up in the following year. In November of 1943, Hitler is going to start coming up with plans of his own because he is aware that there is a threat of invasion along France's northern coast. So, what Germany starts to do is kind of put the defensive up and figure out how are we going to stop this invasion without really knowing exactly where the Allies will attack. So what Hitler comes up with is the Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to be a 2,400-mile long fortification of bunkers, landmines along the beach, and with water obstacles. In January of 1944, Dwight Eisenhower, the general here, is going to be appointed the commander of Operation Overlord, which, coolest name, although the names continue to be cool throughout World War II. Operation Overlord was going to be a massive deception operation that was meant to make the Germans think that the main target was not the beaches at Normandy, that it was somewhere else, one of the points, a different point between Britain and France. So Germany is going to believe that the Allies are going to be targeting somewhere else and have to come up with defense plans elsewhere. Some of the tactics that the Allies use to carry out this deception are that we use fake equipment, we use a phantom army commanded by George Patton that was supposedly based in England. We also have double agents, and we conducted fraudulent radio transmissions. It's going to be great. The battle at Normandy is going to last between June of 1944 and August of 1944. And this is going to result in the liberation by the Allies of Western Europe from Nazi control. Operation Overlord is going to begin on June 6, 1944, which is also known as D-Day. We are going to see some 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces land on the beaches along the 50-mile stretch of the Normandy region. The invasion is one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history and required extremely extensive planning. Prior to D-Day, the Allies, their deception campaign truly did mislead the Germans about the intended invasion target. By late August 1944, this invasion with the deception campaign is going to prove successful because all of northern France had been liberated. And by the following spring, the Allies are going to defeat the Germans. And still to this day, the Normandy landing has been called the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. And what this win here with Operation Overlord proves is that we then see a two-front war being waged on Germany, two front being from the west and from the east, the Allies on one side, and then we have Russia on the other. So the Soviets are going to begin to advance from the east, and Germany is going to have to realize, okay, we have to figure out how to take down one of these advancements because we cannot split and fight both sides. It just isn't going to work, which is exactly what the Allies wanted to do. The Battle of the Bulge is going to be when Hitler tries to counterattack. And this counterattack is going to be referred to by Winston Churchill as the greatest American battle of the war. This is going to take place in the Ardennes region of Belgium, and this will be Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. Hitler's aim here was to split the Allies in their drive towards Germany. The German troops are ultimately going to fail to divide Britain, France, and America in the Ardennes, and this offensive is going to pave the way to the victory of the Allies. But let's take a look because this is a 6-week long, brutal battle. It lasts from December of 1944 to January of 1945, and the reason it's called the Battle of the Bulge is because of how the Allied line had taken the appearance of a large bulge. This battle is going to take place in the Ardennes during the frigid winter conditions, and we are going to see the battle prove to be the costliest fought by the U.S. Army, which suffered about 100,000 casualties. This is going to lead to a huge hit against the German morale. The reason being is because Hitler was unsuccessful on splitting up the Allied forces, and when they are unsuccessful, Germany starts to see the beginning of the end. But Hitler's not the only one that sees the beginning of the end. Mussolini is going to see his end come rather quickly as well. In April of 1945, Mussolini's dream of creating that Roman Empire, him being the next Julius Caesar, his dream is going to lie in ruins. But we've got to kind of talk about what the heck was going on with Mussolini. So, Mussolini is going to first rise to power a couple of decades before World War II when he became prime minister in 1922. He calls himself Il Duce, and he had aligned himself with Hitler and Nazi Germany. But what he doesn't realize is he's kind of got to update his militaristic ideas because he had a very outdated view on the Italian military, and it put him in a terrible condition against not only the Allies but when stacked up against Germany. Uh, we are going to see that by 1943, with the Allied invasion of Sicily, the bombing of Rome, this is going to cause the Italian High Command and King Victor Emmanuel III to remove Mussolini from power. And what they do with him is they place him under house arrest. But this proves to be unsuccessful because in September of 1943, Nazi paratroopers had come in, rescued Mussolini, and then what they do is they go ahead and stick him as a figurehead of the Social Republic of Italy, which was a Nazi puppet state. By April of 1945, though, the Third Reich was quickly losing its grip on northern Italy. And what happens is Mussolini learns of the Nazis who had begun negotiations for an unconditional surrender. And when he learns of that, he tries to escape. He scoops up his mistress, and they try to run. He disguises himself in a German Luftwaffe helmet and overcoat, but the disguise doesn't do anything. This guy had literally painted his face across the world. People knew exactly what he looked like because he had his image put on posters. He was always in the newspaper, and now he was very recognizable. The disguise did nothing for him. So you're going to see that he gets scooped up, and when he does, he is going to he is going to face a very violent end. Once he gets taken, he is going to be executed by machine gun, and there really is no name to the person who exactly did the execution or what happened to Mussolini's body in the hours after his execution. But his capture is going to signal, along with Germany's surrender, Hitler's suicide is going to signal the fall of the Allies in the European theater. So let's talk about Hitler's end, because you know what? Just karma with both of these guys. When we look at Hitler's end, we are going to see that Hitler is going to see the writing on the wall when negotiations begin for Germany's surrender. When Germany begins to surrender, it's going to be under the command of the Germans' high command, who was General Alfred Jodl. And I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation because it's German. General Dwight Eisenhower, is going to demand complete surrender of all German forces, and we are going to settle for nothing less. If this demand was not met, Eisenhower was prepared to seal off the Western Front to prevent any Germans from fleeing, and he was going to force the surrender. So Germany realizes they really have no other option here, and they sign, and on paper we have defeated. The fighting is going to continue in the European theater for about a day after, but the war is going to be signaled over in the West while fighting continues in the East. With this surrender, though, Hitler knew it was coming. Because it takes place in May, we're going to see Hitler see the writing on the wall, and he will go ahead and hole up in his bunker in April of 1945. Where he commits suicide by swallowing cyanide and shooting himself. And very shortly after, Germany gives their unconditional surrender, and we see the end. And what this ends with is what we call VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And Victory in Europe Day is going to be designated May 8th, 1945. All the while the United States is fighting in the European theater, we are also fighting in the Pacific theater. okay? And we have some pretty distinct pieces of the Pacific theater that we need to go over. Now, Japan, we learned, already had the intention of dislodging the United States hold in the Pacific. That was their goal. Not only did they want to destroy our military presence, but they wanted to take the U.S. territories in the Pacific, which included Guam, the Wake Islands, and the Philippines. The day after Japan had bombed at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invade the Philippines. And within a month, the Japanese had captured Manila, which was the capital of the Philippines. And we are going to see the forces within Manila go ahead and retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. For the next 3 months after that takeover of Manila, the combined forces of the U.S. Filipino Army are going to hold out despite their heavy lack of naval and air support. Finally, on April 9th, the we are going to see General Edward King Jr. surrender his about 75,000 troops because they were crippled by starvation and disease. There was no way that they could hold off anymore. With this surrender, though, the Japanese are going to round up those troops and march them some 85 miles to the southern end of the Bataan Peninsula. The men are going to be divided into groups of about 100, and this march is going to take each group about 5 days to complete. The exact figures are unknown, but it's believed that thousands of troops are going to die because of the brutality of the captures, starvation, and the beating that many of them suffered during the march. Any that did survive were taken to prisoner of war camps where thousands more will die of disease, mistreatment, starvation. And this is going to be a blow to the United States. We see the brutality that these men are facing in the war. But America is going to avenge its defeated Philippines in an invasion led by General Douglas MacArthur, who had promised the return of the Philippines and made good on his word. In February of 1945, U.S. Filipino forces are recaptured at the Bataan Peninsula, and Manila was liberated in early March. This is going to lead, after the war is already over, to a trial of the lieutenant that was in charge of the Japanese invasion forces in the Philippines. He is held responsible and put to death for his war crimes by firing squad in April of 1946. Uh, so what we're going to also see is the United States wanted revenge for the attack at Pearl Harbor. So we are looking to fight back and prove our strength. And one of the ways we do that is at the Battle of the Midway Islands. But the Japanese kind of thought that they could recreate and replicate the attack on Pearl Harbor by sneaking up and crushing the rest of the U.S. Pacific Fleet with a surprise attack aimed at the base in Midway Island. Midway is located in the Pacific Ocean, almost directly between the United States and Japan. This attack is going to be carried out by a smaller Japanese force off the coast of Alaska. And what they did here was plan a three-pronged attack toward Midway. First, they were going to attack on in the air, and then they were going to invade the ships with their soldiers, and finally, they were thinking that if they attacked here in the way that they planned, that the United States wouldn't be able to fight back because they wouldn't have the reinforcements from Pearl Harbor, and it would be easy for them to just kind of sneak in. But this isn't exactly how it goes, because US Navy crypto analysis analysts are going to break a code communication and kind of figure out that the attack was coming. And once they figure out where the confirmed location is, the battle at Midway that Japan thought was going to be the greatest sneak attack, Pearl Harbor Part 2, doesn't work. Uh, we are going to see a U.S. victory at the Battle of Midway. Japan is going to have to abandon its plan to expand its reach in the Pacific, and it's going to put on the map this effectiveness of an air attack. And what we see at the Battle of Midway is the real change in World War II from World War I in this technology. And we start to see this as a turning of the tide of the war in the Pacific, which is going to strongly favor the Allies and start to pull down the Japanese morale. When we look at the Pacific Theater, we have to look at the strategy that is going to be deployed here. The goal is to island hop. You see that around Japan there are many, many islands, and the goal was to hop across these islands, take them under Allied control, and move closer and closer and closer to the mainland, where we could strike a mortal blow to the Japanese. And General MacArthur is going to become a big name in the Pacific Theater, really pushing this island hopping strategy to take down the unique threat that Japan had presented. Japanese fighters were a very unique threat in that they weren't afraid to die. I mean, most of us have this normal fear of death, and I can't even imagine how that fear is exacerbated in wartime. But they weren't afraid to die. You guys have heard of the kamikazes and what kind of approach they took to fighting in the war. And that's what took this fighting against Japan to a whole new level. Now, if you're ever interested in a movie, this is going to be in your extra credit, but Flags of Our Fathers is a fantastic movie, and its companion is Letters from Iwo Jima. Both movies present a view of what took place on the island of Iwo Jima. Flags of Our Fathers presents the U.S. view, and Letters from Iwo Jima expresses the Japanese perspective. Now, I will warn you, Letters from Iwo Jima is also entirely in subtitles, so that may not be up your alley, but it is worth the watch, I promise. When we look at the goal of Iwo Jima here, both sides were looking to take hold of this island in the Pacific. But previously under Japanese control will flip to U.S. control. But it's a long and drawn out battle here. The United States military leaders had planned to attack the island that they had believed, and they were tricked into believing, had really been backed off by the Japanese forces. But the Japanese had secretly embarked on a new defensive tactic. And what they had done was burrow into the mountainous landscape and camouflaged artillery positions. On February 19th, 1945, U.S. Marines are going to make an amphibious landing on Iwo Jima, and they were met with completely unforeseen challenges. First, when they reach the beaches, they were able to set up and kind of just make their way on the island, which gives them this false sense of control there. What we see is that there was a lack of immediate response when we pull up to the beaches. And what's going to happen is the United States are able to kind of uh, get comfortable there. And then we're going to see banzai charges by the dozens of Japanese soldiers come as dusk falls. The Marines were eventually able to move past the beach and seize part of Iwo Jima's airfields. Um, but within days, we're gonna see 70,000 U.S. Marines land on Iwo Jima. Uh, Although there's going to be the United States Marines are going to outnumber the Japanese enemy on the island, we are going to suffer severely. Many Americans are going to be wounded and killed over the 5 weeks, 36 days of this battle. We're going to see about 25,000 casualties, nearly 7,000 deaths. Just 4 days into the fighting, though, the U.S. Marines are going to capture Mount Suribachi, which is just the south side of Iwo Jima. You want to get that tactical position of the high point on the island, which we were able to do, and that's where that famous image comes of the Americans raising the flag. That's going to be a picture taken by Joe Rosenthal, and it gives you the premise of the movie Flags of Our Fathers. But after that, battles are going to rage on for 4 weeks. Essentially, we are going to see the this attack, just repeated banzai attacks from the Japanese. Americans are going to eventually take the island, and we capture it. But what they do afterwards is they go and explore the island's jungles and these intricate tunnels within the mountains that had been built, and they find, capture, and kill Japanese holdouts that had been there for long after the island had already been taken, really showing that unique threat of the Japanese. In the Pacific Theater, we are also going to have to talk about the dropping of the bomb. Germany had been designing their own atomic bomb, which is going to put the United States in a position to have to come up with their own. The United States becomes aware of the German nuclear program in August of 1939 when Albert Einstein writes a letter to President Roosevelt warning that it may become possible that they set up a nuclear chain reaction in large masses of uranium, which would create a nuclear weapon. And the United States begins to race to create their own bomb, which gives life to the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is going to be led by Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer. When we see this program developing, it's under the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And it forms the Manhattan Engineer District in 1942, and it was based in New York City with the same name. So we have the U.S. Army Colonel Leslie R. Groves appointed to lead the project. And then we have other facilities operating all at the same time. Okay. In December of 1942, Roosevelt's going to authorize the formation of the Manhattan Project that combined the multiple research centers to really come together in weaponizing nuclear energy. Uh, we have theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had been working on nuclear fission along with others, and he is going to be named the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in northern New Mexico in 1943, and that's where we get the creation of Project Y. And this is where we see the completion of the first Manhattan Project bombs, where they are built and tested. Um, when we see Germany surrender after suffering those heavy losses, uh, we think that this is going to lead to the surrender of Japan. But what we learn is that the Japanese were going to fight until the very bitter end. They were not going to give up. And even after the meeting in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, the US is going to deliver an ultimatum to Japan, and we're basically going to tell them surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. So we gave them a warning. And as the Potsdam Declaration provided, there was no movement on the Japanese front. To surrender. They were not willing to accept the terms, mainly because in the Potsdam Declaration there was provided no role for an emperor in Japan, and because of that, the terms are not accepted. Uh, the military leaders of the Manhattan Project are going to identify Hiroshima as an ideal target for the atomic bomb, given its size and the fact that there were no known American prisoners of war in that city. Um, and you guys know the end of this story here. With no surrender agreement in place, August 6th of 1945, the Enola Gay bomber plane is going to drop the little boy bomb over Hiroshima, and what we see after that is unprecedented destruction and death of an area of 5 square miles. Just 3 days later, still with no surrender declared, on August 9th, Fat Man is going to be dropped over Nagasaki, which was a site of a torpedo building plant, and it's going to destroy more than 3 square miles of the city. The combined two bombs are going to kill over 100,000 people and absolutely level these two Japanese cities. The Japanese are going to inform us that just a few days later they are going to surrender, which results in VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. And you can see from the image, and we're going to talk about it more in class, the absolute devastation of this bomb. Now, when we look at the impact of the war, uh, we are going to see not only lives lost, but money spent. Uh, I don't know why there's a dollar sign there. We have over 60 million lives that are lost in the war. What this war also brings us into is the nuclear age. We're going to talk in just a second about Truman's decision to drop the bomb, because FDR is going to die towards the end of World War II, is going to bring us into a new stage of war. You even see it today. When we look at the way that wars are fought, it's brought us into this new technological age of who can cause the most devastation and the most destruction. But what the war also brings us to is an entrance onto the world stage. We're going to see the United States, whereas after World War I kind of retreat, we are no longer going to be able to do that. All right, I promise not to make this too long. Give me about 15 more minutes and I will cover this section, what we need to do here. Okay, so where does the United States go after what has happened in World War II? Well, first we have to kind of backtrack a little bit. FDR is going to be reelected for a third term in 1940. He's going to be re-elected in 1944 for a fourth term. After this time, we will never see another president go into a third term, let alone a fourth term. It will become a constitutional amendment in 1951 that no president can serve more than 2 terms. The way I remember that is it's the 22nd Amendment, all of the twos. FDR is going to use the radio during World War II, much like he used the radio in the Great Depression. He's going to update the people on what is happening throughout the war. Where are we fighting? What has been done? And it's really going to gain this the attention of Americans to keep up with. How are we doing? Have we defeated the enemy? Uh, in February of 1944, the Yalta Conference is going to be held. We're going to see the three leaders meet here to coordinate the next phase of the war against the Axis powers in Europe and the Pacific. This is also called the Tehran Conference because that's where it took place. The United States and Britain are going to commit to an invasion of northern France, opening up another front of war against Germany. Stalin, meanwhile, is going to agree to join the war against Japan in the Pacific Theater after Germany was defeated. In February of 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin are going to gather at Yalta here. And the Allied forces in Europe see that there is victory on the horizon. After having liberated France and Belgium from Nazi occupation, the Allies are now going to threaten Germany with that two-front war that we had been talking about. This puts Stalin at a distinct advantage during the meeting because he is going to see himself as a leader in the defeat of Germany. So, what we're doing at Yalta is figuring out what to do with Germany after the war. We are going to divide Germany into four zones of occupation controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet military forces. We're also going to see Berlin be split there as well into similar zones occupied by the Allied forces. Um, what we uh, what we see is that the Allied leaders are determined that Germany should be completely demilitarized and denazified, and that they want Germany again to assume most of the responsibility for the post-war reparations, but not sole responsibility like we did after World War One. Now, when it comes to the name of Poland, Stalin is going to kind of promise more than what he gives us. He says that in the last 3 decades, Germany had twice used Poland as a corridor to invade Russia. He says the Soviet Union is not going to return the territory in Poland that they had annexed because of that reason. And that he says he'll allow representatives from Polish political parties into the communist dominated provisional government installed in Poland. And he says, you know what? I'll throw you a bone. We'll allow for some free elections in all territories in Eastern Europe that had been liberated from the Nazis, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Uh, the United States, in return, has to give something up, and they agree that future governments in Eastern European nations bordering the Soviet Union should be friendly to the Soviet regime, satisfying Stalin's absolute desire to influence any area around the Soviet Union. But we realize that by March of 1945, Stalin has zero intention on keeping up his end of the bargain, especially with what he said in Poland. No free elections are happening. These negotiations at Yalta are going to be criticized. And then when we see Truman taking over as Roosevelt's successor, Truman becomes very suspicious of Stalin, and that's going to lead to some tension at the Potsdam Conference, and that's going to push us right into the Cold War. But now we have to kind of talk about FDR's death. FDR is going to die in April of 1945 from a cerebral hemorrhage, and it will be quick. He had been declining for some time at the beginning of 1944, and he had really taken a back seat. And that's something that you can research on your own. I won't fall down that rabbit hole because I've already fallen down enough of the rabbit holes here today. Um, but with FDR's death, we are going to see Truman take the presidency. What we have to recognize, though, is that World War II and FDR will expand the power of the presidency through the New Deal. Um, we saw FDR expand what the government will do for the people, but through the war powers that FDR takes on, we are going to see the president have control of what supplies get made, what property the government has control over. We're going to see the government force entire industries to channel the wartime production. We're going to see the nation's factories become absolute powerhouses, pumping out planes, tanks, military vehicles, weapons, ships, and anything else needed for the war. The use of the war powers is going to take the U.S. manufacturing and grow the output by 300% during the war, despite any disparities that we saw from the Great Depression. So FDR just on steroid with the presidential powers during World War II. And then we see the powers again expanded by Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. Now, Truman, we'll talk about in just a second, but the decision to drop the bomb, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we're allowed to drop a bomb. Nothing. But Truman takes on that decision again, showing the absolute power of the presidency in times of war. And the reason both of these presidents during the New Deal, during World War II, are able to make these decisions is because it was for the protection of the nation. One, the protection of our economy, and two, the protection of our actual people during the war. So Truman is going to have to get a crash course in the presidency after Roosevelt dies. Roosevelt had just been elected into the fourth term, and Truman had become his running mate. And the only reason he was there was because the old vice president had become a divisive figure in the Democratic Party. So they picked Truman, who was a more moderate Democrat. He getting picked is jokingly referred to as the Second Missouri Compromise. And that with this, we see that Roosevelt was able to easily defeat the Republican candidacy, and then we're going to see FDR die very shortly after getting into that next term. He dies in April, he gets in January. That's not very much time. It has been said that there were only a couple of times that Truman and FDR actually sat down together. And in the first few months of Truman's presidency, he's going to have to decide to drop the atomic bombs, go ahead and create the United Nations, and he's going to have to participate in the Potsdam Conference with the leaders of the other Allied forces that had been working with FDR the entire time. And like I said, at Potsdam, we realize that Stalin had lied to us at Yalta and before, and that we weren't really seeing him keep up his end of the bargain, which is going to make Truman incredibly suspicious of Stalin, and that's going to push us into where we're going with this unit into the Cold War. But man, think about having to make all of those decisions in just the first few months of your presidency when you weren't even planning to become president and you had no idea what was actually happening. You have to reform relationships with these world leaders that had become so comfortable with the man that was president. That's a lot of pressure to carry the nation through. At the end of the Second World War, we're going to see this fade away of colonial empires. We are going to see this fade away of imperialism, and we're going to see the United States and the Soviets gain the power, or the title, I should say, of superpower. The reason these two countries are the ones that gain the title of superpower is because of their role in ending World War II. They are going to be absolute powerhouses. They're going to dominate in, it's supposed to say, the post-war talks. They're going to be this leader in the post-war world. Uh, After World War II, the United States is going to see their European allies have to recover again from another world war. And in that recovery, the European allies are going to claim that their colonies will provide significant aid in the form of raw materials after the war. They also say that their colonies will be markets for finished goods that would help that would help Europe recover. But the United States is going to have to try to distance itself from the colonies, and the United States is going to try to convince Europe that it was unappealing to have these interests, especially when they are incredibly unstable after the war. The US isn't really going to force this issue, but it will encourage European imperial powers to negotiate an early withdrawal from their overseas colonies. The United States is itself going to try to be an example, lead by example, by granting independence to the Philippines in 1946. Now, this all sounds good and great and happy and nice of the United States to try to lead this ending of imperialism and colonization, but that's not the way it goes. Once the Cold War starts coming and the Soviet Union starts to dominate, the United States is going to take a completely different stance here. Not that we're going to go out and imperialize all over the place and take colonies, but we are going to have foreign policy concerns that start to look at the European powers losing their colonies or granting them independence and the potential slip to be taken by the Soviets. And this is going to cause Truman and his successor Eisenhower to address these concerns in the Cold War, because it could lead to a severe shift in the international balance if the Soviets were able to take on these newly independent countries. It would really hinder the economic resources of the United States, of its allies. So post-war, we like to say that colonies fade, empires fade, because that's true. We don't. It's not real popular after the war, but the Cold War is going to change what that actually means. All right, last piece, I promise, and then we're done. The United Nations is going to be created post World War II. Now, just like with World War One, we realized that after World War II, we have to have some kind of international organization that would be committed to. Solving these problems within the world without another world war. At Yalta, Stalin is going to agree to Soviet participation in the United Nations, which will be the international peacekeeping organization that Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to form all the way back in 1941 as a part of that Atlantic Charter that we talked about in the last lecture. He's going to give this commitment to the three leaders and agree on the plan that would give permanent members to the organization's Security Council who would hold veto power. So we have the agreements here. We have the key issues all hammered out. They agree to meet again after Germany's surrender in order to finalize what post-war Europe would look like, and figure out how to really hammer out the deals here. But what we look at is when the United Nations is created, it was created under super optimistic hopes that the Soviets would continue their peacetime promises, which really doesn't happen. But Besides the point, it's created in the spirit of globalism. Let's get everybody talking, let's get everybody together. Isolationism after World War II is not going to work, even knowing we see significant loss. It's brutal, it's devastating. Americans are pretty dang interested in what's going on beyond our borders. What we see, the UN charter is going to call for a security council that serves as kind of an executive branch in the UN. What they can do is they can authorize sanctions, and they have the authority to use force or deploy peacekeeping troops. Now, that's what makes this incredibly different from the League of Nations. The United Nations is going to have some muscle. Now, there are two big parts of the United Nations. We have the great powers and we have the General Assembly. The great powers are going to be the US, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. They all have permanent seats and they all get the power of veto. Action from the United Nations cannot be taken without all five in agreement, which leads to Cold War tensions. When we get to the Cold War tensions, when we can't get all five of them to agree, we get into a stagnation here. Uh, Besides the great powers, there are going to be 10 seats that get elected by the General Assembly every 2 years to also have that power of veto. When the Cold War tensions really start to ramp up and we can't get the Soviet Union to come and be in agreement, when we can't get them to come and vote, we start to vote without them. So we'll see that during the Cold War as well. The General Assembly is known kind of as the town meeting of the world. You have committees that are addressing ongoing issues, humanitarian and legal concerns. They are going to be able to pass resolutions and can make recommendations to the Security Council. The General Assembly is where everybody has a seat at the table. Every small nation, every big nation, everybody gets to come together and talk about the problems. So the United Nations, we can say, is the League of Nations on steroids, and it's actually pretty successful given that we learned from our mistakes in World War I. Now, if you're still here, I appreciate you staying for the entire time. I apologize, but there's just so much good information to talk about with World War II. We can't help ourselves. Don't forget about your 3 assignments that are due this week, and some of you I will see in class. All of you I will see on Wednesday, and if I don't see you, have a wonderful break.